The definition of variation is that it's differences between organisms. Variation can either be genetic, which means that it's inherited, you get it from your parents, or it can be environmental. An example of genetic variation would be your natural hair colour or your natural eye colour. An example of an environmental characteristic could be the haircut that you have, because this isn't caused by your genes, it's caused by something external. The reason why we have variation in the first place is that organisms need to be able to survive different habitats. So, for example, polar regions or the deep sea are really, really different, and you need variation in species to allow them to survive there. There are two types of variation that you need to know about: continuous variation and discontinuous variation. The definition of continuous variation is when the individuals in a population vary within a range. This is the key word, range. So you can tell that something is continuously variable because when the data is shown on a graph, there's no separate groups. So if we look at height here, you can see that the individuals in this population vary in height within a range. And this graph shows what's called the normal distribution. The normal distribution shows that most individuals measure within the middle part of the range, which is here, whilst some measures are at the two extremes. So you have the really small people, like me, and you have the really tall people, like Mr. Roberts. So in a normal distribution curve, most individuals measure within the middle. Some measure at one extreme and a few measure at the other extreme, but most are within the middle. So we've talked about continuous variation there, which is when the individuals in a population vary within a range. Now we need to talk about discontinuous variation, which is where there are two or more separate groups. So an example of a characteristic that is variable, but which is discontinuously variable, is shoe size or blood group. Because if you take a certain population, so say the class, and you were to measure the shoe size, you would either be, for example, a 4, a 5, a 6 or a 7. Or if you were to take blood groups, you would either be an A, a B, an AB or an O. There's no range. You either are a 4 shoe size or you're not. You either are a blood group A or you're not. So that's the difference there between continuous variation and discontinuous variation. That's pretty much all you need to know on variation. You need to know that there are two types, genetic and environmental. Genetic is inherited via your genes from your parents. Environmental is caused by an external influence. The reason why we have variation is that so we can survive different habitats, such as the polar regions or the deep sea. There's continuous variation when the individuals in a population vary within a range. There's no separate groups, the example being height. Height for a population on a graph will fall within a normal distribution, which is also called a bell curve, like this, where most individuals are in the middle. So here they're of average height. You get some below average like me and some above average like Mr. Roberts. The opposite to this is discontinuous variation, where there's two or more separate groups. So the example would be shoe size, where you're either this, 5, 6 or 7. There's no range. You can't have a shoe size that's between 4 and 7. You're either a 4, a 5, a 6 or a 7. And then blood groups. You can't have a blood group that's between A and O. You either are an A or you're not an A. You're a B or you're not a B. So that's the difference between discontinuous variation and continuous. And that wraps up variation. The next video will be on evolution, and then there's not long to go.